Welcome you to this class on Preface to Shakespeare by Samuel Johnson. Now, in the previous classes, I discussed Johnson's, analysis and Johnson's attitude towards Shakespeare's writing. Johnson is basically dealing with Shakespeare's plays in this particular essay, and he focused on the strengths of Shakespeare. The merits of Shakespeare. And he also refuted some of the allegations raised against Shakespeare. Now, basically, those are known as Shakespeare's merits by Dr. Samuel Johnson. So, after analyzing the merits and after refuting some of the allegations raised against Shakespeare, he will gradually go to the weaknesses of William Shakespeare, obviously according to Samuel Johnson, not according to me. And you will see that how Johnson, discovers or tries to discover, tries to find out and explore the weaknesses of William Shakespeare. But remember one thing, it's Johnson's point of view. So you may disagree with him and you may go against him, but what is necessary? That you have to also show your arguments. So at the very beginning, when I started this essay, I told you that at first we want to know what Johnson says about Shakespeare, how Johnson looks at the strengths and weaknesses of William Shakespeare. What are the areas that Johnson thinks are Shakespeare's strengths and what are the areas Johnson thinks are Shakespeare's weakness? So after knowing that, we will also try to analyze Johnson as a critic. Now, in the previous discussion or in the previous classes, we noticed that Johnson said Shakespeare's portrayal of nature is realistic and Shakespeare's characterization is extraordinary. Shakespeare's individuals are individuals and at the same time they are also representative of a larger community. I explained it in the previous classes. I said that Macbeth is an individual, Hamlet is an individual, King Lear, Othello, they are also individuals, but they also represent, a larger community of their types. So Hamlet is different from Macbeth. Macbeth is also different from King Lear. King Lear is also different from Othello. So they are individual characters. But despite being individual characters, they also represent their class. So there are many Hamlets, there are many Macbeths, there are many Othellos, and there are many King Lears, not only in England, throughout the universe. And Johnson says that this is the reason why Shakespeare is so popular and his plays are so popular across the globe. Now, he will gradually go to Shakespeare's weaknesses. But before going to that, those weaknesses of Shakespeare, according to Johnson, he says something which is really striking and which goes against most of the critics. Most of the critics of the world, they think and they consider that Shakespeare's tragedies are superior to his comedies. That Shakespeare was a very successful tragedy writer. And his comedies are also good, but compared to the comedies, his greatness lies rather in the characterization, in arousing pity and fear in the tragedies. And we also notice one thing, that the protagonists of Shakespearean plays, basically the tragedies, are far more well known and popular and familiar in the world than the characters of the comedies. In this point, we will discuss that Johnson said Shakespeare's natural affinity for comedy, but Johnson goes against the tradition the other critics think, or against the view and opinion of other critics, that Shakespeare's skill basically lies in portraying the tragic protagonists. Rather, Johnson says that Shakespeare was very, he was very skilled, he was very spontaneous while delineating the characters in the comedies. So, according to Johnson, Shakespeare's comedies are basically the outcome of his natural, genius and his spontaneity, and he didn't require any effort to write the comedies. So, let's go to that. Shakespeare wrote his plays in keeping with his natural disposition. He was unaware of the rules of dramatic writing. So Shakespeare was unaware of the rules of dramatic writing. Basically, Johnson is, he is also talking about or giving indication to the rules of Aristotelian, Aristotle's poetics and the rules that were maintained by the Greeks and the Romans. Reimer's argument that Shakespeare's natural disposition lay in the direction of comedy is correct. So he is another critic, and Johnson supports him that Shakespeare's natural, genius and natural strength lies in his comedies. In writing tragedy, Shakespeare seems to have toiled hard. So, according to Johnson, Shakespeare toiled, that means Shakespeare uh, exerted his effort in writing tragedies, which he didn't need or didn't require in writing the comedies, because comedies, according to Johnson, they basically emerged without the effort of Shakespeare. It came, the comedies came, or the comedies were born spontaneously. His comic scenes, on the other hand, are spontaneous and successful. So, according to Johnson, the comic scenes, created by William Shakespeare are spontaneous and successful. Comedy was congenial to his nature. So Shakespeare was that type of playwright who was habituated and who was skilled and who felt rather comfortable in writing comedies. I'm again telling, it's not my opinion, it's not my view, and it's not even the views of other critics. Rather, most of the critics think that his tragedies are greater than the comedies. But Johnson thinks his comedies are greater than his tragedies. And Shakespeare was, very spontaneous in writing the comedies. In his tragic scenes, there is always something wanting, but his comic scenes often surpass our expectations. So, according to Johnson, his tragic scenes, Shakespeare's tragic scenes, or you can also say the tragedies, they lack something. So that's what is meant by the word wanting. That means his tragedies lacked something. So the tragedies were not complete. So they had some, or they possessed or shared some loopholes and weaknesses. On the other hand, the comic scenes or the comedies by William Shakespeare, they have surpassed our expectations. His comedy pleases through the thoughts and language, whereas his tragedy pleases mainly through incidents and action. So Johnson also makes a kind of distinction between tragedies and comedies from different angle, and the angle is, according to him, his comedies are full of thoughts and language. So the thoughts in the comedies of William Shakespeare are, very philosophical and well knitted, and the language is also excellent. On the other hand, the tragedy, the main strength of Shakespearean tragedy, according to Johnson, are the incidents and action that Shakespeare maintained in his plays. So the tragedies are extraordinary because of the thoughts and language. The comedies are extraordinary because of the thoughts and language, and the tragedies are okay because of the incidents and action. His tragedy is a testimony of his skill. There is two things. There are two things. Number one, skill, and number two, ingenuity or naturalness. So, when you talk about skill, a person can be skilled, but that person may not possess natural ingenuity, natural strength. He may not possess. So, Johnson says that Shakespeare's tragedy is a testimony, that means is the outcome of his extraordinary skill. He was very skilled. His comedy is the product of his instinct. On the other hand, Shakespeare's comedies are the product of his instinct, that means of his internal thoughts and of his spontaneity. So Shakespeare didn't require any effort. Though time has brought in many changes of customs and manners, the force of his comic scenes has not abated. With the change of time, with the passage of time, customs have changed, traditions have changed, and yet the comedies are still enjoyable, and the attraction of the comedies has not declined. The intrigues and vexations of the characters in the comic scenes still continue to please us because of their originality or genuineness. Why? The comedies are still very enjoyable because the intrigues, the deception, the plots, and the intricacies and the allegations, the humiliations used by William Shakespeare in the comic scenes, they are still very familiar. I have said the customs have changed, the traditions have changed, practices have changed, but the charm of these sort of scenes has not vanished, has not declined. Why? Because those scenes, according to Samuel Johnson, the scenes in the comedies are original and genuine. The appeal of his comedies has stood the test of time. So the appeal, the attraction of the comedies of William Shakespeare, it has surpassed time. It has gone beyond time. Shakespeare seems to have obtained his comic dialogues from the common intercourses of life, and not from the language of polite society or from that of the learned people who tend to depart from the established forms of speech. You know, According to Johnson, Shakespeare has taken the language of his comedies from real life situation and everyday life. On the other hand, in the tragedies, he has used language which is not used in the real life situation, according to Johnson. So Johnson says that the language Shakespearean characters use in the comedies is the language of real life situation and taken from our society. On the other hand, the language he uses in tragedies, it's not the language in which the common people or the people of the society speak. Shakespeare's familiar dialogue is smooth and clear, yet not wholly free of ruggedness or difficulty. And Shakespeare's, dialogues, they are smooth and clear, and yet not wholly free from difficulty. Well, there is a kind of bit of difficulty in Shakespeare's dialogues, and not Shakespeare's dialogues, the dialogues of Shakespearean characters. But still, you can say the dialogues are smooth. So the basic difference between comedies and tragedies I have already explained. The comedies are original, the dialogues used in the comedies are original, the characters in the comedies are appealing, attractive, the dialogues are taken from real life situation. On the other hand, and obviously the comedies are basically the outcome of Shakespeare's genuineness and originality. On the other hand, his tragedies, according to Johnson, are basically the outcome of his extraordinary skill. So, according to Johnson, Shakespeare's comedies are superior to Shakespeare's tragedies. And I have already said that this is not the traditional view towards Shakespeare. This is just the opposite view or opposite treatment of Shakespearean plays. Maximum number of critics, they say that Shakespearean tragedies are far more superior to his comedies. And now weaknesses of Shakespeare. And now we are straight going to the weaknesses of Shakespeare according to Johnson, obviously. Virtue sacrificed to convenience, it's a dangerous allegation. And why dangerous allegation? Why virtue sacrificed to convenience? Remember one thing. There is one term called poetic justice. So what does poetic justice mean? Poetic justice means that the virtuous characters or the good characters, they are supposed to be, appreciated and rewarded at the end of the play. On the other hand, the evil characters or the bad characters, they are supposed to be punished at the end of the play, and they should be shown to suffer in this world. And that's how the playwrights want to instruct the world. And this is, traditional instruction. So Shakespeare basically didn't maintain it. He didn't maintain poetic justice in his plays. So in many of his plays, in many of the Shakespearean plays, you will notice one thing, that even the good characters, they suffer in the end, and sometimes you will see the bad characters, they throughout their life, throughout the maximum span of their life, they enjoy time. So the opposite things may happen. So whether Johnson's allegation against Shakespeare is right or wrong, we will discuss it later. But Johnson alleges or raises the allegation that Shakespeare is ready to sacrifice virtue in order to please the audience. So Shakespeare's instruction is, very weak. And Shakespeare, in many cases, he failed to instruct the audience. So convenience means, opportunity or favorable situation. So Shakespeare sacrificed virtue for favorable situation or for the climax of the drama, disregarding the necessity of instruction. So he didn't think about giving instruction to the audience. The excellence of Shakespeare must not blind us to the fact that his works have numerous defects too. So Johnson warns us against the kind of complacency the readers have towards Shakespeare. The readers think that Shakespeare is a great name and Shakespeare possesses many strengths and qualities. Even Johnson also agrees that Shakespeare possesses many qualities. But he also warns us, saying that let it not happen that his qualities are basically blinding us against his weaknesses. Actually, these defects are so serious. Johnson says that Shakespeare has serious defects, that they would have sufficed to overwhelm the merit of any other writer. And if it was not Shakespeare, if it was someone else other than Shakespeare, then Shakespeare possesses so many weaknesses that it might have overwhelmed other writers or other playwrights. But Shakespeare has survived only because of the strengths he possesses. Otherwise, his demerits or his weaknesses could have overwhelmed his strengths. He has so striking or so, you can say, serious weaknesses in his dramas. The first impropriety in Shakespeare is that he sacrifices virtue to convenience. So that's what I have already discussed. So Shakespeare's complete disregard to virtue is, disliked by Johnson. I didn't say that Shakespeare disregards virtue. Johnson says that Shakespeare, disregards virtue to convenience. That means whenever he finds the opportunity of giving, pleasure or giving excitement or giving a kind of climax to the audience, he was ready to sacrifice the virtue and is more careful to please than to instruct. So this is the main allegation, that Shakespeare was always focused to please the audience than to instruct the audience. And why I say this, why Johnson said this, because Shakespeare didn't maintain poetic justice in his play. It is not incorrect to say that Shakespeare seems to write without any moral purpose. It doesn't mean, it is not incorrect to say. Johnson also indicates that it will not be incorrect if we say that Shakespeare didn't have any moral purpose. So according to Johnson, a writer should have some moral purpose. And what is the moral purpose? That the writer will give some instruction to the people, to the audience. So Shakespeare didn't give any kind of moral instruction to the audience because he has hardly shown the virtuous people or the good people to prosper in life. Although we can select a whole system of axioms, his place it is not, because he has paid any conscious thought to morality. So he was not at all conscious of morality. He was not at all conscious of giving the necessity, conscious of the necessity of giving instruction to the audience. So he was never conscious of that. These precepts seem to come from him in a casual manner. In Shakespeare's plays, there is no just distribution of evil and good. So Shakespeare's treatment of evil and good is not just or justified. So his treatment of evil and good is under question by Johnson. His virtuous characters do not always show a disapproval of the wicked ones. So the characters who are virtuous in Shakespeare's plays, they do not always show, or they do not always disregard the wicked ones or the wicked desires. So some of the virtuous characters have also share some weaknesses and some moral degeneration in their characters. His characters pass through right and wrong indifferently, and at the end, if they serve as examples, they do so by chance and not by the author's efforts. So sometimes we see that some virtuous characters, they are, uh, proclaiming their virtues, but those proclamations are basically accidents, and they come accidentally. So there is no genuine standard of morality in the characters of Shakespearean plays. Basically, the protagonists and basically the characters who are well known for their virtues. So what he wants to mean, that if you look at Hamlet, if you look at Macbeth, so who is Macbeth? So I'm not supporting Samuel Johnson. I'm just trying to make you understand that what Johnson alleged, or what kind of allegation he raised. So from Johnson's point of view, if we look at Macbeth, then we will notice one thing in Johnson's favor, that Macbeth is the villain and he is the protagonist. That Macbeth doesn't have the moral scruple that we expect from him. And if we look at King Lear, he also shares some striking weaknesses in his characters, like arrogance, like foolishness, like pride. If we look at Hamlet, we will notice the excessive philosophizing of Hamlet or Hamlet's character. If we look at Othello, we will see that his excessive jealousy. So these protagonists or these characters who are the protagonists of the famous plays, they also, share some striking weaknesses. The fact, and they don't have any moral scruple. So what will you learn from King Lear? What will you learn from Macbeth? What will you learn from Hamlet? What will you learn from Othello? So did they instruct, or did Shakespeare basically give any message through these characters? Did Shakespeare convey any message through these characters? According to Johnson, they didn't. And that is his allegation against Shakespeare, that Shakespeare didn't care for moral scruples. Shakespeare didn't care for moral preaching or moral teaching. But, if you ask another question, if you ask Samuel Johnson, that is moral preaching necessary for a successful drama? So that's a different question. We will criticize Johnson afterwards, not now. The fact that the period in which he lived was not too refined is not an excuse for this defect. Now you can say that when Shakespeare used to write these plays, the age was not so much solid, the age was not so much refined, so Shakespeare also didn't care for the moral scruple. So you cannot defend Shakespeare saying that, because Shakespeare was a great playwright. So he could go beyond his time. So these realities prevailed during his lifetime, and Shakespeare might have simply copied those realities in his plays, but still we expect greater performance and greater concern from Shakespeare towards morality than he has done. Every writer has the duty of trying to make the world a better place to live in. So that's the expectation of Samuel Johnson from Shakespeare, that according to Samuel Johnson, every writer has a kind of duty towards the world, and he has to, or she has to, perform the duty towards the world. And Shakespeare completely ignored it, and that's why he did not at all think about the moral scruple of the characters. So that was one thing, that Shakespeare was completely careless and he was completely, unaware, not unaware, he disregarded the necessity of projecting virtue and the necessity of giving instruction to the audience. So that's the allegation we discussed so far. Now, carelessness about plot development. This is another striking allegation against Shakespeare, that Shakespeare was careless about plot construction and plot development. So, you know what is plot? Plot is basically the structure in any play, and basically, a play deals with a single plot, though Shakespeare violated it. In Aristotelian drama, you will notice that there is only one plot. So, what I said about plots, I said that plot is a kind of structure in any drama based on which a story is written, not written, a story is formed or molded. Shakespeare's plots are often loosely knit, so that is the allegation against Shakespeare, and carelessly developed. That Shakespeare did not concentrate on the development of plot, and he was to some extent careless about the development of plot, and the plots are very loose. In a majority of the cases, just a little more attention would have been enough to improve them, and Johnson thinks that if Shakespeare was little more attentive to the development of the plots, his plots would have developed to a large extent. In fact, in his plays there are plenty of opportunities to instruct or delight, but he makes use of those that are easy and rejects those which demand more effort and labor. So the allegation is that Shakespeare exerted more effort on easy things and he ignored the areas which required more labor from him. So Shakespeare was careless about things which required more attention from him, and he paid attention to those areas which were not necessary, which were rather much easier. So, according to Johnson, Shakespeare's sense of proportion of giving attention to areas of the drama was not right. In many of his plays, the latter part appears to have been neglected. And according to Johnson again, these areas are very important, dear students. Remember that these areas are really very important. In many of his plays, the latter part appears to have been neglected. So Johnson again raises the allegation that in many of Shakespearean plays, the later part, I mean, you all know that there are 5 acts in Shakespearean plays. So Act 4 and 5, you can say, or Act 5, is neglected by Shakespeare. It seems that when he was approaching the end of his work and the reward seemed near at him, that he exerted less labor on the work in order to complete it quickly and derive the profits immediately. So the allegation of Johnson is that Shakespeare, I am reading it again, it seems that when he was approaching the end of his work and the reward seemed near at hand, he exerted less labor on the work in order to complete it quickly, not in it quickly, and derive the profits immediately. So when Shakespeare approached the ending or the conclusion of his play, he was almost in a hurry, according to Johnson. He became careless and he just wanted to get the reward. Get the reward means not simply getting the reward in the ordinary sense, but just to complete the play, just to make it happen. So according to Johnson, he did not give due attention um, towards the end of his play, and he hurriedly completed or hurriedly finished his play, and he gave less effort towards the end of his play, and he ignored the ending of his play. You can go against Samuel Johnson, you can also criticize Samuel Johnson, you can say, well, Samuel Johnson's allegation against Shakespeare on this particular point is not right. You can do that, but I am telling you again and again that at first we want to know what Johnson says. As a matter of fact, it is the conclusion at which he ought to have exerted his maximum labors. Johnson says that a playwright should give the highest effort in the conclusion. On the other hand, what Shakespeare did, that he exerted the lowest effort, the least effort in his ending. And lack of attention has resulted in the catastrophe in several of his plays being improbably produced or imperfectly represented. And as a result of Shakespeare's, indifference towards ending, according to Johnson, in many of his tragedies, the catastrophe is improbably produced, or the catastrophe is not well organized. You know what is catastrophe? The ultimate fall of the protagonist. So the ultimate downfall of the protagonist, or the ultimate tragedy of the protagonist, the catastrophe is not well organized because of the indifference of William Shakespeare, according to Samuel Johnson. Anachronism, you know what is anachronism? Yet another fault, this is another fault. So we are discussing Shakespeare's weaknesses, and this is the third point basically. Another fault in Shakespeare's plays is anachronism, his violation of chronology. You know what is chronology? From time to time, or his indifference to historical accuracy. Shakespeare is indifferent about the distinctions of time and place and gives to one age or nation the manners and opinions which pertain to another. This is detrimental to the effect of likelihood of the incidents. Alexander Pope opines that this defect is to be attributed not to Shakespeare himself but to those who interpolated the unnecessary details of their own into his plays. But Johnson does not agree this. Shakespeare makes Hector quote Aristotle in Troilus and Cressida and mingles classical legend with Gothic mythology in A Midsummer Night's Dream. However, it must be confessed that he was not the only violator of chronology. Sidney, a contemporary writer who was also learned in his Arcadia, confounded the pastoral period with the feudal age, whereas the two ages were quite opposite to each other. So the allegation is that Shakespeare disregarded the chronology, that means the starting, according to writing something, according to time frame, that you are starting from the past and then you are gradually coming to present and future. So you have to maintain the time, you have to maintain the clock time, the time, the dates of the calendar while discussing, while narrating the story. And violation of time and place, we will come to this discussion later, but Johnson doesn't raise the allegation because of the violation of three unities, but the violation Shakespeare did, that the character of 15th century is speaking like the character of first century or second century. So Shakespearean characters are speaking like Aristotelian characters, and this is the allegation against Shakespeare. So a character of England is speaking like the character of like a German person. So a person, and an uneducated person is speaking like an educated person. So the improbability of things, and the characters of one age or one tradition are speaking the way the people of 10 or 15 centuries back used to speak. So the characteristics of one century are imposed upon the personalities or characters of another century. So that is the allegation against Shakespeare by Samuel Johnson, and he also, mixed another type of, thing, that classical legend with Gothic mythology in Midsummer Night's Dream. If you read Midsummer Night's Dream, you will see that there are two worlds. One is the world of the fairy world, one is the fairy world, and the other is the human world. And it creates a kind of confusion, according to Johnson, not according to me. So the supernatural machineries being used in Midsummer Night's Dream, according to Johnson, was not a good decision by William Shakespeare. But whether it's a good decision or not, we will discuss again, I said, later. And Shakespeare is not the only person who violated this sort of anachronism, but there are other writers like Sidney who also violated this sort of anachronism. Coarseness of dialogues. So the dialogues, the characters of Shakespeare used, they are not refined dialogues. Coarseness of dialogues. Shakespeare's plays also have faults of dialogue and diction. So this is another allegation against Shakespeare by Johnson, obviously. According to Johnson, Shakespeare's plays, they have faults in their dialogues and diction. Diction means language. So the dialogues of Shakespearean plays, they are faulty and the diction is weak. The language is also faulty. The dialogues in the comedies are exposed to objection. Johnson praised Shakespeare's comedies because, according to Johnson, they were spontaneous. But Johnson objects to the dialogues of the comedies when the characters are made to engage in contests of wit and sarcasm. Many of their jests are generally indecent and gross, and there is much licentious and indelicacy even where ladies join the conversation. So the dialogues, the characters of the comedies, sometimes they exchange dialogues, the words they use, they are indecent words. And even the ladies are involved, even the women, they also use indecent words. Even the refined characters speak on the same level as the clowns, and often all distinction between the two is lost. So Shakespeare made his characters speak in the same way. So the serious characters, the protagonists, the language they used, even the clowns used the same language. Whether this was the real conversation of ladies and gentlemen of his period is difficult to say. And Johnson questions that whether this is the language the characters or the real life characters during Shakespeare's time they spoke, or just Shakespeare imagined this sort of conversation. But the coarseness of this conversation in Shakespeare's plays cannot be approved. So Johnson says that Shakespeare is a great writer, there is no doubt about it, but we cannot approve the language in which Shakespearean characters sometimes speak, because the language is not refined, and sometimes the language is also indecent. The words the characters use, basically the women use, the words are very indecent. It is the writer's duty to make suitable selection even in the forms of gaiety. So it is the writer's duty to make suitable selection. So Johnson says that it was Shakespeare's duty to choose the words appropriately. So Shakespeare failed to do that, and that's why the words, the sentences, the vocabularies, and the dialogues the characters of Shakespeare used, the dialogues were not refined. So this is a great allegation against Shakespeare. Performance in tragedies ores when more labor is spent. This has been already discussed. Still, I'm discussing it in brief. That the Shakespeare's performance in writing tragedy was not up to the mark, up to the level, according to Johnson, though Shakespeare exerted much labor on it. And the second point over here is undue verbosity and prolixity of words. The narrative parts of Shakespeare's plays show an undue pomp of diction and verbosity full of repetition. And the characters, when they spoke or when they uttered long dialogues or long sentences, the language and the verbosity or the words, the sentences they used, they were full of repetition. And they used, extraordinary words, extraordinary sentences, but the sentences meant hardly anything. Instead of enlivening the narration by making it brief, Shakespeare endeavors to make it effective through dignity and splendor. So Shakespeare could have used less word, fewer number of words, but he didn't do that. He rather made his characters speak, bombastic words and extraordinary words. Flamboyant speeches, inflated vocabulary. So the continuation of the previous allegation. The set speeches in some of his plays is dispiriting, cold, and feeble. It appears that as Shakespeare's powers were natural, he performs badly whenever he endeavors to create a particular effect deliberately. Often he seems to be involved in some unwieldly sentiment which he seems unable to express and unwillingly to drop. Complexity or intricacy of language does not always accompany subtlety of thought. So Shakespeare sometimes makes his language unnecessarily difficult. So making the language difficult cannot maintain the subtlety of thought, cannot make the thought difficult. You can make the sentences difficult, but those difficult sentences may not convey a difficult message. So what Shakespeare did, that Shakespeare used flamboyant speeches, inflated vocabulary, unfamiliar words, but those unfamiliar things hardly meant anything. Quite often the quality of words does not correspond to that of the thought or image for which they were employed. And Shakespeare, what he wanted to convey, in most cases he failed. He used a word, he used an expression in order to mean something, but all his efforts went in vain because he failed to convey that message. So his Shakespeare's use of extraordinary words basically went in vain. Trivial sentiments and vulgar ideas are at times clothed in sonorous epithets and high-sounding images, and sometimes Shakespeare, very trifle or trivial sentiments and vulgar ideas, they are expressed using some adjectives, using some similes, metaphors, imageries, high-sounding images, but basically they signify nothing. He often loses the heights of poetic loftiness by the use of some idle conceit or dry equivocation. So sometimes Shakespeare also sacrifices the lofty, the philosophical ideas by using some conceit or some extraordinary words. So he loses the theme, he loses the philosophy. Shakespeare loses the thoughts for the sake of using, flamboyant words and speeches. In such cases, terror and pity are degraded into a sort of frigidity. Thus, the intense feelings aroused by him suddenly lose their intensity and become weak. So, Shakespeare, in this particular area, also failed because his flamboyant speeches, his extraordinary vocabulary, they were, targeted to convey important message, but all they fail. So the use of this sort of speeches and vocabulary completely went in vain and became unnecessary. Craze for puns, wordplay. So you know what is pun? A word is used, but it has got double meaning. Lastly, Shakespeare could never resist a quibble. Whatever be the occasion of the dialogue, whether the situation be amusing or tense, Shakespeare seizes the opportunity of employing a pun. So Johnson says that Shakespeare had a kind of, a tendency to use pun. So whether it was necessary or not, Shakespeare didn't mind. He started using pun. Pun means using a single word having double meaning. Love of quibbling misleads Shakespeare just as the will-o'-the-wisp misleads the traveler in marshy places. A quibble is, after all, a trivial thing. So according to Johnson, quibble or pun, it's not something gorgeous. It's trivial. But it had such a fascination for Shakespeare, but Shakespeare was fascinated by pun, that he would sacrifice reason, propriety, and truth for its sake. So it's a huge allegation that Shakespeare loved pun so much that he was ready to sacrifice rationality, propriety, and even truth for using pun. You know what is pun? I am using the word son. So what does son mean? Son means, son of a father, and son also means the son that gives us, rays. So this is pun, that you are using a word but having double meaning. So your sun has set. So your sun has set, it means that the sun might have set, or your sun, that means somebody's sun has expired. So that is called pan. And Shakespeare was very much fascinated by this pan. And Johnson alleges that this pan, for the sake of pan, Shakespeare sometimes sacrificed rationality, propriety, and truth. It is to him like the golden apple for which he would always turn aside from his path. His fatal Cleopatra for which he would lose the world and be content to lose it. He was prepared to spoil his whole play for the sake of quibble. So Johnson is really very angry with Shakespeare for his excessive use of puns in his plays. And he says that Shakespeare was ready to spoil anything of his play for the sake of pun. So what are the weaknesses of Shakespeare we discussed in today's class? Craze for puns, that means word play. Shakespeare preferred to play words with words, so Johnson didn't like it. And flamboyant speeches and inflated vocabulary. Shakespeare wanted to use vocabulary and extraordinary speeches. Johnson also disliked it. And Shakespeare's performance in tragedies, according to Johnson, is worse than comedies. Shakespeare sometimes made his characters speak in dialogues which are unrealistic and which are indecent and licentious. And there is anachronism, that means there is the violation of time, and the characters are expected to speak in one manner, but they speak in a different manner, and there is the violation of time frame as well. Carelessness about plot development, so there is problem even in Shakespeare's development of plot in different plays. And there is also, Shakespeare is also alleged for his tendency to sacrifice virtue for convenience. So these are the weaknesses identified by Samuel Johnson of William Shakespeare. Now I discussed the merits of William Shakespeare according to Samuel Johnson, and now I also discussed the weaknesses of William Shakespeare by Samuel Johnson. I will take one more class in which I will discuss Samuel Johnson's views towards Shakespeare's violation of three unities, and I will also recap some of the previous lectures on Preface to Shakespeare, and I will take, as I said, one more class. The next class will be the final class on Preface to Shakespeare. So till then, goodbye, stay safe.